Good evening. My name's Ray Estefania. I'm the executive director and one of the founders of Family Recovery Specialists. We are an outpatient addiction treatment and mental health program. We also do interventions and therapeutic consulting. We work with adolescents, we work with young adults, and we work with older adults. So we do primarily addiction treatment, but also mental health. General mental health. We're located down in South Miami. And we do a lot of these kinds of presentations too, a lot of prevention work, because what we know is that it's much easier and better to prevent someone from ever having a problem with substances than to have to treat it once it becomes a problem. So we do believe in prevention, and that's really, the main reason we're here tonight. So thank you for being here. I'd like to make this sort of interactive, okay? So, feel free to jump in, ask questions, comments. I'll leave some time at the end for questions as well. But I like this to be sort of a discussion. I've got a lot of information, but I know you may have questions, and so I want to make sure that I try to get you the information that you're looking for tonight. How many of you have been to one of the previous sessions? Okay, good. All right. So this may be overview for some of you, although they've been different topics. And tonight, we're really talking about what you can do as a parent to prevent your child from ever getting involved or ever, having a problem with substances. And I've been doing this for 20 plus years. And there's one thing I've learned, and there's one thing that all the research shows, and that is the number one reason that children decide not to use drugs, that they decide to remain drug-free, is parents. Study after study shows that parents can make a huge difference and a huge impact on whether or not your child ends up experimenting. So we're going to talk about tonight what you can do as a parent. It doesn't always work, right? And I meet lots of parents who, for all intents and purposes, did everything that they were supposed to do, and they still ended up having a child that got in trouble. But most of the time I meet families that made a fair amount of mistakes along the way. And I'm going to try to talk to you tonight about what some of those mistakes are and how you can avoid making those mistakes. So you've probably, if you've been in some of the sessions already, you've learned about brain development, right? You've learned about the adolescent brain. You've learned about how what we used to think the brain was fully developed by about 21. The insurance companies, if you look at sort of why we wait till you're 21 to drink, why your insurance rates tend to drop, when you're in your early to mid-20s. Actually, the latest research now is saying about 24 or 25 is when we think the brain is really matured. And so if we look at that science of brain development, and we understand that a child who is 14, 15, 16, 17 years old is not mature, their brains are not developed, they don't have the ability to curb their impulses, delay their gratification, kind of look at things rationally, weigh consequences, make decisions that don't always feel good, right? That's just part of being an adolescent. Would you agree? You all have children here, correct? And so you understand that as parents, we are that part of the brain for them. We have to be that executive part of the brain for them until they're at an age where they can start to make decisions more like adults. And so they're vulnerable, right? They're vulnerable as teenagers to lots of things, but they are particularly vulnerable to the effects of substances on their brain. And so what may take an adult years to become addicted to a substance can happen to an adolescent very quickly in a matter of months in some cases. It does depend on what they're experimenting with, you know, sort of what drugs they're experimenting with. Obviously, there are some drugs that are more addictive and more dangerous than others. But the common ones right now that we're seeing that we really should all be worried about in here, because these are the ones that kids tend to start experimenting with, are the ones that you already know, right? Alcohol being the sort of the most widely abused substance of any of them, whether it's illegal or illegal. Marijuana. We're having a particularly challenging time nowadays, especially in the work that I do, with this whole marijuana legalization issue. And we have lots of states that are legalizing marijuana in one form or another, whether it's for medicinal use or it's even recreational use. And that's confusing people. It's confusing kids, and it's confusing parents. It's even confusing us, to be honest with you, as treatment providers. How do we handle this? Because we just have a lot of kids, and parents even, where their understanding of the perception of harm with marijuana has gone way down, because people just think, well, it's legal, so it must not be a problem. And we'll talk a little bit, it's not really part of the topic tonight specifically, but we will touch on why I think this is such a slippery slope and where I think it's going, and maybe what we can do as parents to, you know, kind of discourage our kids from going down that road. So, you know, adolescents are at greater risk for addiction and mental health issues. We know that addiction is a developmental disease. We know that most adults who are addicted started when they were teenagers. Occasionally you find adults that, you know, sort of became addicted later on in life, but most of the time you can trace it back to their teenage years when they started experimenting, and then as it progressed, eventually it led on to other things. And again, remember that kids will always use the drugs that they perceive to be less harmful first. So the alcohol, the marijuana, the nicotine. Now we've got another challenge with nicotine, right, which is the vapes and the e-cigarettes, and right. So these things were developed to help adults stop smoking. That was the purpose of these things, you know, being developed. And now what's actually happened is, well, they may be helping some adults to stop smoking, but what they're doing now is getting a lot of kids to be introduced to nicotine and to become addicted to these e-cigarettes and these Juuls and things like that. So we got a lot of challenges right now for kids and for us as parents. And unfortunately, I meet a lot of parents in my work that they're just confused. They're completely confused, right? I mean, I guess my parents were confused too when I was growing. I remember telling my parents, you know, saying things like, well, you know, Mom and Dad, everybody's doing it. Well, they're still saying it today. And here's the problem. Not everyone's doing it, but a whole lot of them are doing it. And the difference is, back when I was growing up, and maybe when you were growing up, you had those kids that used drugs. They were kind of that group over there that you knew who they were. They looked the part. They were sort of that little clique that was sort of the drug users. It's not that way anymore. It's kind of more mixed among all of them. You'll have kids that hang out with kids who don't, and it's perfectly acceptable that the ones that do, you know, they all kind of it's much more common and acceptable for them all to sort of be mixed in together. And listen, you know, we do have kids who make the right decisions and don't use drugs. We absolutely do. I don't see a lot of those kids because I see the ones that are in trouble. But we also have a lot of kids who are doing things that sometimes mom and dad are accepting. Sometimes mom and dad are really being very permissive about it because they don't know what to handle, how to handle it or what to do about it. I'm finding a lot of parents that you know, that maybe had their own history of experimenting or using drugs, or maybe even still do. I had a a young man a couple of years ago, 15 years old, that his parents brought him to me, and he was addicted to marijuana. And they wanted me to help him stop, get him to stop using. Well, through the course of getting to know the family, I found out that Dad was an attorney, and Dad smoked marijuana, and Dad had a stash of marijuana in his sock drawer. And the kid got introduced to marijuana by going in Dad's sock drawer and stealing his marijuana and smoking it with his friends. And I remember finding this out and confronting the father and saying to him, how do you expect me to help your son and get him to see that marijuana is bad and he shouldn't do it when he knows that you're doing it? And I said, the only way we're going to make this work is if you take a look at your use and you make some changes and show him that you can be a model for change. And ultimately, that's the way we had to work it. So I just run into a lot of families nowadays that have their own stuff going on, and unfortunately, that kind of handicaps their ability to send the right messages to their kids. So, you know, what are kids trying to do, right, at this developmental stage, at sort of teens and into young adult? They're trying to individuate. They're trying to sort of learn their identity. They're trying to figure out who they are. They're rebelling against you as parents in many cases. They're rebelling against your values and your morals and things like that. That's part of what adolescents do. We kind of expect that. They're in that developmental stage where they take risks sometimes that we may not like. So some of this is normal and we should expect it. But we also need to be very clear about what's okay and what's not okay as parents. And we're going to get more into that now. Any questions so far? Oh, one last point, this last one that I think is pretty important, and I touched on it a little bit already, but teenagers have a very hard time delaying gratification. They have a very hard time regulating their emotions, too. They have a hard time dealing with stressful situations. That's, again, part of the immaturity, part of the need to let the brain develop a little more. But that impulsivity, that inability to regulate, that difficulty they have delaying gratification sets them up perfectly to experiment with drugs. Drugs are immediate. They offer instant gratification of the highest kind. And once the teenage brain gets introduced to something that's very, very euphoric, marijuana, alcohol, nicotine, even harder drugs, once they experience that, it's so incredibly powerful that there's this strong reinforcement, and they want to continue to feel that. Adults experience the same thing. That's really what addiction is. Addiction is, this substance stimulating the most primitive part of your brain, the part of your brain that's responsible for everything that you do that feels good. And if you think of something that you do that feels good, running, I don't know, for me, eating chocolate. I like to eat chocolate. Right? Whatever it is that you do that feels good, and multiply that times 1,000. Multiply that feeling times 1,000, and that's what marijuana feels like to a teenage brain. That's what cocaine feels like to a teenage brain. And they will then pursue that feeling, because that becomes so reinforcing. Nowadays, and I just spoke about this last night at a Miami-Dade County Public Schools town hall here on Miami Beach, but we talked about technology too, and screen use, and how we're finding the same characteristics, right? We're finding that social media and video games and all this technology is working on the same parts of the brain where addiction is also developed. And so scary, interesting. We're seeing a lot of studies on this, and I'm seeing a lot of kids that are 16, 17, 18, 19 years old that now have substance problems. And what I'm finding is a lot of those kids started out at 8, 9, 10, and 11, and 12 years old, being very obsessive and very compulsive about video game and other screen use. And the parents will come to me and say, oh yeah, he's had a problem with video games forever. He plays hours and hours and hours. He doesn't want to come out of his room. How do I get him to stop? There is a lot of data that suggests that heredity is probably a major factor. I mean, when I meet some kids who have an addiction problem and I start going back in the generations asking about family history, it's amazing how I can usually identify many generations that have suffered with some sort of addiction problem. And sometimes people don't even realize it was an addiction problem. So genetics definitely plays a role, but so does environment, right? And so does, you know, exposure and things like that. So they all play a role. So we're finding a lot of information out about just all the things that affect the adolescent brain. You know, technology, substances, all mental health issues. There's lots of things that put kids at risk. Genetics puts kids at risk. Mental health issues can put kids, you know, ADD, depression, anxiety, these kinds of things when kids are very young can set them up later to have problems with substances. Exposure, peer pressure, seeing someone at home who uses, trauma. We're finding out more and more that trauma has a lot to do with why kids ultimately end up using drugs. And sometimes you wouldn't you wouldn't think something is trauma. I'll give you an example. Divorce. Anybody think divorce is traumatic for a kid? Absolutely. So we have a lot of families who are divorced, and they may get along really well, and they may co-parent really well. Often they don't, but sometimes they do. And but that's still trauma for a child, right? It was a huge, huge change in what they knew as their life. And so we're finding trauma is a big factor. So what's our job as parents? What are we supposed to do? How do we encourage our kids to make the right decisions? Well, number one, you know, I think you coming here is a big part of it, right? You getting educated, you understanding that there's things you need to know, you want to be prepared for. I'm a big believer that we have to start talking to our kids when they're really, really young. I go out to high schools, I go out to middle schools, but I even go out to elementary schools. I think you have to talk to them age appropriately, obviously, but I think by 4th and 5th grade, you should be having conversations about drugs in a way that they can understand. Something happens, folks, it's interesting. Again, I speak to all the different age groups. Something happens in the transition from elementary to middle. It's pretty amazing, right? In elementary school, there were no way, just say no, I would never do that, that's so dangerous, right? They repeat almost everything that they've heard you and their teachers and everybody say. And then once they shift into 6th and 7th and 8th grade, those attitudes change. And all of a sudden now, you know, I'm not so sure. They become curious and the attitudes, you know, start to shift the other direction. And if I look at where I start seeing kids getting into trouble, it's in that transition. Actually, any point of transition tends to be difficult for children. So, you know, elementary to middle is difficult. High school, middle to high school is difficult, and then really difficult high school to college. I see a lot of young adults start to have problems there too. So what can we do? What can we do? Well, communicate, talk to them, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to have the difficult conversations. Let them, you know, open up, hear them, listen to their attitudes, right? Be totally honest, right? You have to be willing to have those conversations. Now kids, right, we all know this because we're parents. Kids sometimes think that listening means we have to agree with them, right? So sometimes we can listen and hear them. That doesn't mean we necessarily agree with their position. I've had to teach my older daughter this over the years. She's 24 now. I think she finally gets it, you know? I can listen to you. That doesn't mean I'm going to necessarily agree with you. She never liked that. But it just is what it is. If I don't agree, I'm going to let you know. And if it's a rule that I'm not going to negotiate on, well, you know, that's what it's going to be. There has to be room for negotiation with kids. We all know this if we're parents. Black and white doesn't work for everything. But I am a big believer that when it comes to this particular issue, drugs and alcohol, I really believe that it does have to be black and white. Now, I'm not one of these people that thinks that kids aren't going to experiment. They are going to experiment. That's part of what they do as kids, and we should all be prepared for that. That doesn't mean I have to co-sign it, facilitate it, or make it easy for you. And so as a parent, when I was raising my 24-year-old, you know, it was always interesting because you know what I do for a living, right? So she didn't get away with much, but I'm sure she got away with some things. But it was always clear in our house what the expectation was. And the expectation was, until you're 21, you're not to drink, right? There is no drug use. We won't allow it. We don't care what it is. We made things very... Now, did she do these things? Yeah, I'm sure she did. I'm sure she did, and I know she did, because looking back, we've talked. But it never became a real problem because we did not make it easy for her. And we were always very clear about what our you know, the big problem that parents get into is sending mixed messages. They say one thing and they do something else. And that's always a setup for a problem. Or you got two parents that don't agree, right? That happens a lot. Listen, my wife and I were very different in a lot of ways. I think sometimes that's why we get along so well, but we don't always agree on parenting. And we certainly made some mistakes along the way in certain areas, but we've always tried in this area, and I think for the most part, we were always on the same page. It just was something we were not, it was not okay. And we heard our daughter, I can remember one time my daughter went to a private school in South Miami, and she had a core group of girls, friends that she grew up with. And I can remember when she was 17 years old, she went to a birthday party of one of the girls. It was a Venezuelan family. And I can remember this like it was yesterday. We found out later that at the party, the mother proceeded to pour shots for all the girls. And they all had some shots at the party. Now, I found out about this about 2 or 3 days later, after the weekend had passed, and, you know, I think it got filtered through my wife, and then my wife wasn't sure whether she was going to tell me. And then ultimately she did tell me, and, well, you can imagine that I called the lady that had provided this party, and had poured, and you use your imagination how that conversation went, but it didn't go well. And I told my daughter, you'll never go to another function at that house again. It's just not, it's not going to happen, because I found, and I thought I knew these people. I mean, we weren't super close, but we knew them. We knew them, and we realized at that point that we didn't share the same values when it came to this particular issue. So I never let my daughter go there again. And I just felt that was my job as a parent, right? To make sure that she understood that that was not okay. So we need to love our children. We can love them, but we can reject their behavior, right? We don't have to agree with everything they do. We have to have clear limits. We have to set boundaries for them and make sure that they understand what those boundaries are. And so we also have to be a role model, right? We must be a role model for our kids. I talk to parents all the time. Like, I mean, I think that attorney was a perfect example of someone that was sort of taking the approach of do as I say and not as I do, right? How was I going to help that child when this father was smoking marijuana and the kid knows it, and so how's that going to work? It wasn't going to work. And so I think what I say to parents all the time is examine your own relationship with, let's say, alcohol or other substances. Make sure that you're modeling the kind of behavior. You know, I always tell families, you know, it's okay to drink. It's okay to have a social relationship with alcohol. It may even be okay for some people to smoke marijuana nowadays. You know, I think it's becoming more and more common and more acceptable. But what you have to do is model a social, casual relationship with something. Not show them that every day I get home, I'm so stressed out from work and I'm in a bad mood and, you know, I've had a terrible day and the first thing I do is sit down and pour myself a drink, you know, to calm myself down. That's not sort of modeling a social, casual relationship with alcohol. So I think being a role model is really important, that we do what we say and we you know, say what we mean and so forth. It's really important because kids see through it. I can tell you that. If you say something but you behave in a different way, they see right through it. Don't rescue them. It says don't rescue them from their feelings. Also, don't rescue them from the consequences of their actions. I think it's important that we remember we have to be parents. And it's important to know that kids need boundaries. Actually, it's interesting because I think what we see over and over is that kids feel safer when they have boundaries. Kids feel safer when they know what your position is and where you stand on something. That way they don't necessarily have to go figure it out for themselves. I talk to a lot of kids who aren't necessarily, don't have a problem with substances, but I talk to a lot of kids who feel pressure to use substances because of their own peer pressure, right? Pretty common. It's pretty prevalent nowadays, but there are kids who don't. And you know, it's funny, a lot of kids will blame it on their parents. They will say something to their friends like, oh, no, I can't do that. My parents, I'll get in really a lot of trouble. You know, I can't, you know, my parents they'll kill me, right? And they use that as the excuse, and it's true, they are afraid of their parents in that way, but it's also their way of kind of being able to save face a little bit when they're saying no to their friends. And so I think it's important for them to know where, a lot of parents don't realize that you may be against drug use, you may think that you've had the conversation, you may think you've been clear with them, but then sometimes I'm talking to a family and I'm asking the child and I say, have your parents talked to you about how, you know, where they stand on this and what the expectation is? And they say, well, no, not really. We haven't really had a conversation about it. And so I think it's important to have that conversation, to sit down and really be clear about where you stand and what's okay and what's not okay, and don't wait till they're in the 10th grade of high school to do it, right? You probably need to be having that conversation when they're in that transition period from elementary to high school, and then again, you know, from middle to high school, and just reminding them. Don't assume that you just had the conversation once and they're going to remember. Because we all know that kids, they forget, they don't remember, and they remember what they want to remember, and they forget what they want to forget. So it's just important to keep having those conversations. Set rules, right? Set consequences. Make sure that that there's natural consequences. I think a lot of times, what I know what I've struggled with sometimes is sometimes the consequence for my child is also a consequence for me. I had a parent the other day was talking about, well, the consequence is going to be I'm going to take away her car. But the problem with that is now I have to drive her everywhere she has to go. And I said, well, that's true. You know, the consequence for her does end up being a consequence for you, but it's an important one that you show her as a consequence that you can actually follow through on. Sometimes we set consequences, or actually we make threats as parents that we don't often follow through on. So it's important, again, I always say this, say what you mean and mean what you say. So if you say it, mean it. If you set a consequence, follow through on it. I work with a lot of families who threaten consequences but never follow through, so the child basically understands over time that, well, they they don't really mean it. They're not going to do anything about it. And don't rescue them from the natural consequences of their behavior. We sometimes do that as parents, right? We sort of feel bad, and we want to soften things a little bit, maybe get them out of a little trouble. The best consequences are natural consequences. I remember when my daughter was in high school, she tended to procrastinate sometimes with homework. And so she had a thing that she would do. She would wait until the very last night, and the deadline was the next day. And she had some assignment that she had to do. And her bedtime, I forget what it was 11 o'clock or 10:30 or something like that. And she would procrastinate and want to stay up all night. And then she'd be a wreck the next day if she did that. And you know what? We didn't let her do it. We said, no, you should have thought about this earlier. You're going to go, if you want to get up early in the morning and you want to be up at 5 and you want to try to, great. But otherwise, you can walk into your teacher and let her know that you didn't do the assignment. And that was the natural consequence for her of procrastinating. And believe it or not, over time, she eventually got better with it, because she hated the idea of being embarrassed and walking in to the classroom and saying, I don't have the assignment. You have to figure out what works for your family, but there's certain things about parenting that are really just about consistency and doing the same thing over and over. And when it comes to this issue, it's so much of it is really about being clear with them and making sure that they understand where you stand on this. If you waver, if you're wishy-washy, if you're not sure, it's going to come across. And unfortunately, I have a lot of parents that fall into these traps, right? Things like, well, I want him to learn how to drink and be able to be responsible. So I'm going to host a party with his friends so that he can, drink here at home safely and not go out there and do it. Anybody ever seen this before? I mean, somebody's hosting all these parties right? Sometimes the parents aren't home, but a lot of times they are home. So it doesn't work, folks. What the kid hears is, oh, you're okay if I drink. And trust me that, they're not going to just drink at home. They're going to drink out there too. I think it's a slippery slope. I think for a lot of kids, it probably won't turn into a problem. But I think for some kids, it does sort of send the message that you're okay with them drinking. And I think it does kind of pique their curiosity. And I've seen it lead to problems later on. Someone always brings up France. Always. There's always someone are you from France? Okay, but there's always someone that brings up France. I'm not sure why, but I guess, So there's this misconception that in France there's not drinking problems, right? That kids drink from the time they're yay high and they have wine. And I don't know if you know this, but there's huge rates of alcoholism in France. Nobody recognizes it, nobody calls it that, but it is. So I think what you're saying is that, yes, in certain cultures, right, kids are introduced to alcohol at a very young age. I think that's true in France. I think it's true in a lot of Latin American countries. I think it's true, and I think it's true here for a lot of families. And I do think that there's this misconception that if we sort of teach him how to drink from a young age, that he's going to grow up to drink responsibly. And actually, if you look at all the data and all the research, the opposite is true. The younger they start experimenting and the more they think you're okay with it or you're co-signing it in some way, the more likely they are to do it, not with you, but out there as well. Here's another one I hear a lot. I'm okay if he smokes a little pot as long as, his grades are okay. I smoked a little pot when I was young, so, what's the big deal? Anybody ever heard that one before? Here's one problem with that. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, but trust me when I tell you that the marijuana that's around today now is not the marijuana that was around when I was growing up. it's a different drug. It's a different, potency of drug. It's more addictive. We've got edibles now. We've got potent, medical marijuana that's, super potent, highly addictive. We've got this oil now. I don't know if you know this, but this oil that kids smoke, so they can get these, e-cigarettes or the Juuls or whatever they call them. They can be walking around with marijuana oil in them. A kid could walk in here right now puffing on one of these things, and you would think it's just one of those nicotine things. You wouldn't smell anything, and he's in here smoking oil. And it's 80, 90, 95% THC, where the average marijuana, good marijuana, is 30, 35%. So it's really, I sort of tell parents now, remember in the 80s we had cocaine and we had crack. Well, we still have it, but cocaine and crack. Well, this oil is like the crack form of marijuana. Listen, I know kids that they order drugs on the dark web. They find recipes to make, research chemicals, and it's crazy what they can get a hold of with their phone. So just to piggyback on the oils, big problem right now. I had a lady come up to me after the presentation I did last night, very nice lady, and she came up to me and she asked me if I knew about these oils that the kids are smoking. I said, yeah, I know plenty about the oils. And she said, my 17-year-old daughter does this. Is that a problem? And she says she's very high achieving. She's in honors, and she says all her friends are doing it. And I just looked at her, I handed her my card, and I said, here, you probably need to call me. I told her, yeah, it's a big problem. I have kids, young adults, college students that smoke this stuff every day and end up in psychiatric hospitals with psychotic episodes because they're experiencing, this almost an overdose for their brain of THC. And they don't realize what they're doing. And the potency of this is just off the charts. Respond to it the same way you respond to anything else. Kids are always going to tell you, well, all my friends are doing it. It's okay. He does it, she does it, they're fine. I think as a parent, you say, look, they may be fine. I don't know if they're fine. But I know that in this house, in our house, our value is that this is not okay. And we're not going to be okay with it, right? This is a drug, it's addictive. When you're older, when you're mature, if that's what you decide to do, then I can't control you at that point. But right now, this is not okay with us. I think if you get into the debate about is it harmful or not, or he can do it or she can't, it's a losing battle. Right? Because they just don't understand that. I think it goes back to what we said earlier. As a parent, you just have to say, here's what's okay, here's what's not okay. I'll listen to you, we can talk about it, but you're not going to change my mind when it comes to exposing you to drugs that are potentially damaging and dangerous and have health consequences. And, it's just like anything else. Why can one person drink and have a casual relationship with something and another person can't? They're different. And, we don't need to get into this huge conversation about why they're different, but they are. And too many parents fall into those traps, right? They get into those discussions and they're losing battles. And once you're in it, you've lost, right? Because you're trying to rationalize with someone who doesn't think rationally. And so it's easier and I think more effective to just sort of take that real clear approach. And I do believe that when it comes to alcohol and drug use for our kids, it really is black and white. You may be able to get them to understand why these things are bad, but remember, kids don't think like adults do. They never will. It goes back to the brain development issue. They're kids. You can educate and you can certainly have the conversations and you can certainly let them know. I was in a group yesterday. Leslie was there. I was doing a presentation to some middle school kids, and there was clearly 2 or 3 or 4 kids in the room that I knew should be my patients right now. Right? I mean, it was clear to me by the questions that, yeah. I should have snitched on them I think the school knew who they were too. But it was clear to me that they have a problem and that they are actively smoking marijuana and maybe doing other things. And they were trying to bait me a little bit into this discussion, and I just didn't, I didn't go there because I know that there's nothing I'm going to say to that kid to change his mind. I'm not even going to waste my breath because he's already made up his mind. He's doing it. I could, 99% sure that he's doing it. And so, sometimes as a parent, it's better not to engage and just to let them know what the expectation is and what the consequence is. If you may not agree with it, you don't have to agree with me, but here's what happens if your behavior tells me you're not following the rule. I really view my job as a parent, at least as it relates to this issue, my job as a parent is to get in your way as much as possible. I'm going to make it so difficult for you to do this that you're just not going to want to do it. And if you do keep pushing the envelope, there's a treatment program for you somewhere if that's what you need, whatever. But I'm not going to budge on this issue. And unfortunately, too many parents right now, and listen, I don't pretend to have all the answers. Listen, I do this for a living, so I can speak to this because this is what I do. I'm not saying it's easy. It's so confusing right now. How do we do this? It just seems like it's overwhelming. And I think a lot of parents do get overwhelmed by their kids and by, look at all the messages. Look at the media, look at social media, look at music, look at where all these kids are getting the message that it's okay. It's not a big deal to smoke weed. It's not a big deal to drink alcohol. E-cigarettes, everybody's doing it. What's the big deal? It tastes like cherry, right? I mean, this is what we're up against. And it's tough. Here's what I'm getting at. When your child goes out on Saturday night, it comes back at, 12 o'clock or whatever it is, you need to be up. You know what you do when they walk through the door? You give them a hug. How you doing tonight? How was it? You smell them. Right? But you need to be up and looking at them and have, you know how many parents I talk to that say they're sleeping? They're dead asleep when their kid walks in the door at night at 1 or 2 in the morning. You're sleeping? Really? How do you know what's going on? How do you know what kind of condition he or she came in? You don't. When they're vaping, are you talking about vaping marijuana oil or are you talking about vaping just regular nicotine? Two very different things. They will be, you think that, have you ever seen someone who's high on marijuana? Okay, all right, I have too. I might have been high myself once or twice. So this is like using oil is like 10 times what that would look like. They'll come in like in a complete daze. You will know if you're paying attention. You will know if you might not catch it the first time, maybe the second time, but if you're paying attention, you will know. You have to find that balance. No extreme is good, right? You can be too permissive and you can be honestly too disciplinarian and too authoritative and too much of an enforcer too. So I'm not advocating for that kind of an extreme. What I'm advocating for is finding that balance between communication, having open communication, having clear limits, having clear boundaries, and understanding and having your kids take you seriously and know that when you say something, you mean it. If it swings to that way and you find yourself in that kind of a power struggle, then maybe now you need some kind of outside help. Maybe you need me or someone like me or something to sort of help you start, because it sounds like now it's heading in the territory of a power struggle, and that could mean the kid is testing you, pushing your limits, just being defiant, rebellious, or it could also mean your child is now addicted and can't stop and is pushing back. And listen, all kids are different. So some kids are going to respond to that and some aren't, and some are going to push more and some are going to be right? And so I think it also depends on the child in particular and the personality and your family dynamic. So I'm not advocating that you become that either, because I think that'll backfire on you too. But somewhere there's got to be, some balance that that can work. There's great stuff on the internet. If you go to like NIDA.gov, National Institute of Drug Abuse, they actually have some links that'll take you to age-appropriate stuff for kids. I can do that. Actually, if you take this brochure here and you go to my website, which is there, and you go to links, I have reading and special links on our website that will give you websites that are have prevention materials for kids. I don't think scare tactics particularly work. In fact, the data, the research shows that they're really not that effective. So I'm not sure that's the way to go. I think more just being honest with them, sharing the information with them, you know, having those conversations, making sure they're educated. But I'm not a big believer in using a scared straight approach. I don't think it works. But there's a difference between showing them reality and consequences and creating a scenario that's set up to try to scare them. I don't believe in sugarcoating it. And I talk with kids pretty bluntly, you know, about what can happen. I've even brought speakers with me that have had horrific things happen to them, and but it's real, it's reality. I'm thinking more like scared straight stuff is almost an approach that you take where you exaggerate it some for effect, and I think kids see through that, and it's not honest, and it doesn't feel like it's real. So I'm not opposed to you talking about facts and showing them what reality is. Anything you do on this topic just needs to be made sure that it's geared towards the age you're talking to. So I wouldn't walk into an elementary school and start showing images on a screen of people with needles in their arms and stuff, which is what that show sometimes, you know, is really about. So I wouldn't do that, right? I go into a 9-year-old or an elementary school and I start talking about the difference between medicine and substances, and I talk about the brain, and I talk about, you know, the effects of certain drugs, and I talk about why it's so important for them to be drug-free. You know, I just keep it very age appropriate. Now, as they get older, then obviously you can start to adjust and adapt to what an older kid can handle. Addictive personality is kind of a broad term that's used pretty loosely. Some kids, kids who have attention deficit disorder can seem like they have addictive personalities. And sometimes they do, right? Sometimes they have some of those characteristics. But I do see kids that show signs of compulsivity and impulsivity and are obsessive about certain things, right, when they're very young. And those kids could be more at risk to grow up and have a problem. It doesn't mean they will, but they may have some of the risk factors that could mean that later on they're going to have a problem with substances. And oftentimes when I talk to a kid who's 16, 17, 18 years old and does have addiction, and I start going back in their history, a lot of times I find out that at 8, 9, 10 years old, they were very compulsive about certain things. So hindsight is always, right, it's easy to look back and say, oh yeah, but you know, when you're in it, you don't necessarily recognize it. I think that if you have a child that's young that shows some addictive or compulsive kind of personality traits, sometimes it's not a problem, but I think the level of the problem is going to really be determined by, are they functioning okay? Is this starting to interfere in school, in other, you know, social life, things like that? And I think you'll know it as a parent. I mean, you'll understand that something's not right. And I think if you're not sure, you can always seek out a therapist or a child psychologist or someone like that. But usually, if they're behaving that way, it's going to kind of show itself in different areas, and it's going to start to be problematic. Whether it's at school or it's in their relationships or it's with the video game. I mean, I talk to parents sometimes who say they have to physically pull their kid away. You know, they have to lock up the video game because the kid will go crazy. And then we get into, well, is this a kid problem or is this really a parenting problem? because sometimes I find in those situations that the parent has kind of created the problem, especially with video games, because they've allowed too much use and it's become obsessive and compulsive, and they haven't really set appropriate limits around it. It can, I don't know that it creates an addictive personality, but it can sort of aggravate or exacerbate a kid who may already have those tendencies. So here's what I would leave you with. I think the most important points. Don't think as a parent that this can't happen to you, number one. Don't think that if your child ever starts experimenting, and many do, don't think that the problem's going to solve itself and that you should just let it sort of run its course. That's a huge mistake parents make. I often meet with parents who now have an addicted child, and I say, well, how long has this been happening? How long have you known that this was, well, you know, we realized, you know, 2 years ago that he was doing this and that and the other. And you didn't do anything? Well, no, you know, we thought it was just sort of normal teenage behavior, and we thought it would just kind of work itself out. Well, it doesn't. I mean, it often doesn't. And so I would say that the minute you become aware that there is a problem, there should be some intervention. That doesn't mean that you need me. It just means maybe it's sitting down, having a conversation, reminding them again, letting them know what the expectations are, what the limits are, and making sure that, you know, if your consequences haven't been working, then maybe it's time to raise the stakes a little bit and increase the level of those consequences. But so again, just being clear, checking your own attitudes about alcohol and drug use, making sure you understand, how do you feel about it? Where do you stand on these issues, and are you clearly communicating that to your kids? And if you're confused, it's okay, but don't let them see that you're confused. Make sure that you figure out what it is you need to do to be firm and to send a clear message so that they can hear exactly what you expect them to do.